The evening sun cast long shadows across the endless prairie grass as Matthew Harris guided his horse along the worn trail leading to Virginia City. His cavalry-trained eyes constantly scanned the horizon, an old habit he couldn't shake even 3 years after Appomattox. The threadbare blue coat he wore had long since faded to a dusty gray, but he couldn't bring himself to wear any other color. Some wounds, he'd learned, went deeper than bullets could reach. The distant lowing of cattle carried on the wind, and Matthew's mare nickered softly in response. Ahead, Virginia City rose from the plains like a mirage, its wooden buildings weathered by sun and wind. He'd heard talk of Confederate veterans settling here, carving out their own fierce paradise far from Richmond's surrender. His hands tightened unconsciously on the reins as memories of Antietam flashed unbidden through his mind. A wagon train of settlers passed him on the road, dust-covered families with hope still bright in their eyes. A young woman with a baby at her breast caught his attention. Rebecca Young, he'd later learn, and she offered a tired smile that reminded him why he'd accepted this job in the first place. The cattle drive needed protection, and his old commander David Wright had recommended him personally. The saloon's bat-wing doors creaked as Matthew entered, conversations dying as patrons noticed his faded uniform. The bartender, a bear of a man named John Lewis, continued polishing a glass with deliberate slowness. "We don't much care for blue coats in these parts," he drawled. But Matthew detected something beneath the hostility. Fear, perhaps, or resignation. "I'm here about the cattle drive," Matthew replied evenly, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "David Wright sent me." The name carried weight. Wright had earned respect from both sides during the war. John Lewis set down his glass and nodded toward a corner table where a striking woman sat studying ledgers, her dark hair streaked with premature gray. Hannah King looked up as Matthew approached, her eyes sharp as she assessed him. "Wright vouched for you," she stated without preamble. "We've lost 3 herds this month to raiders, Confederate deserters calling themselves the Gray Riders. They're led by a man named Michael Young. No relation to the settlers. They think the war's still on." Matthew's throat tightened at the mention of raiders. He'd seen too many burning homesteads, too many dead civilians. The familiar cold sweat began between his shoulder blades, but he forced himself to remain still. "I've dealt with their kind before," he managed, though his voice sounded distant to his own ears. Hannah's expression softened slightly. "We've got 50 families depending on those cattle making it to Santa Fe," she explained. "The settlers need the money from this drive to survive the winter. The Gray Riders," she hesitated, "they see themselves as continuing the fight. Every Yankee settler they drive out is a victory to them." The saloon's other patrons had resumed their conversations, but Matthew felt their sideways glances. A weathered man at the bar wore a Confederate cavalry sword, while others sported gray kerchiefs. Not quite uniforms, but clear statements of allegiance. This wasn't just about protecting cattle. This was about whether the war would ever truly end. Night fell over Virginia City as Matthew made his way to the boarding house run by Grace Wright, David's widow. The smell of fresh bread reminded him he hadn't eaten all day, but his appetite had fled. In his room, he removed his gun belt with trembling hands and sat heavily on the narrow bed. The walls seemed to close in as memories of screaming horses and burning wagons threatened to overwhelm him. Grace brought him a plate of food and coffee, her kind face creased with concern. "David wrote to me about you," she said softly, "about Antietam and after. You're not alone here." She touched his shoulder gently before leaving, and Matthew found himself able to breathe again. Tomorrow the cattle drive would begin, and with it his chance to face the demons that had chased him across 1,000 miles of prairie. A knock at his door revealed Rebecca Young, the young mother from the wagon train. "Mrs. King said you'll be protecting us," she said, her baby sleeping peacefully in her arms. "My husband died at Cold Harbor. I won't let his killers drive us from our new home too." Her quiet determination steadied Matthew's nerves. This wasn't about blue and gray anymore. It was about helping people build something new from the ashes of war. Dawn found Matthew at the cattle pens, where Hannah introduced him to Andrew Lewis, the trail boss. The big man's Confederate past was evident in his bearing, but he showed no hostility. "Way I see it," Andrew said as they discussed the route, "war's over. Time to live in the now." But his hand rested near his gun as he spoke, suggesting the past wasn't quite as buried as he claimed. The morning air carried the familiar scent of sage and prairie grass as Matthew checked his saddle straps one final time. 200 head of cattle stretched before him in the holding pen, their low bellows mixing with the creak of leather and jingle of spurs as the rest of the crew made their preparations. He fought to keep his hands steady as memories of another morning, one filled with cannon smoke and screaming horses, threatened to overwhelm him. The cattle's rhythmic lowing helped anchor him to the present, much as it had during his first drive after the war. Hannah appeared beside him, her practical ranch dress replaced by riding clothes that spoke of long experience in the saddle. "Victoria and Grace will handle the chuck wagon," she said, referring to her two most trusted ranch hands. "They know these trails better than most men." She paused, studying Matthew's face with concern. "Are you certain you're ready for this? The route through Confederate territory isn't just dangerous because of raiders." Matthew nodded, forcing himself to focus on the tactical aspects rather than the emotions churning beneath the surface. The herd would need to pass within 20 miles of a settlement he'd heard whispers about, a place where former Confederate officers had set up their own fiefdom, refusing to acknowledge the war's end. Rebecca and the other settlers would be especially vulnerable during that stretch. Andrew Lewis approached, leading his horse and accompanied by a weathered man Matthew hadn't met. "This here's Michael," Andrew said. "Best tracker this side of Santa Fe. He'll be riding point with us." Michael's eyes held the same haunted look Matthew sometimes saw in his own reflection. Another veteran, though Matthew couldn't tell which side he'd fought for. Some wounds transcended uniforms. The wagon train began assembling behind the cattle pens. 12 families with everything they owned packed into creaking Conestogas. Rebecca Young stood by her wagon, checking the harness on her team of oxen with practiced movements. Her baby was now strapped to her back in a native-style carrier, a practical solution that left her hands free. The sight reminded Matthew of why he'd agreed to this job. These people deserved their chance at a new beginning. As the sun climbed higher, Andrew gave the signal to move out. The massive gates swung open, and the first cattle began flowing through like a brown river. Matthew positioned himself along the herd's right flank, where he could keep both the cattle and the wagon train in view. His horse, a steady bay gelding, seemed to sense the importance of their task, responding to the lightest touch of rein or heel. The first few miles passed uneventfully as they settled into the rhythm of the drive. But Matthew couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. Twice he caught Michael studying the horizon with unusual intensity, though the tracker said nothing. The vast emptiness of the plains could hide many dangers, both real and imagined, and Matthew had learned the hard way that paranoia sometimes kept a man alive. Near midday, they passed the skeletal remains of a burned-out homestead. Hannah rode closer to Matthew, her voice low. "That was John's place," she said. "He refused to pay protection money to the Confederate holdouts. They made an example of him." The charred timbers stood like accusatory fingers against the sky, and Matthew felt his jaw tighten. The war might be over on paper, but out here, old hatred still burned hot enough to consume everything in their path. The wagon train's pace began to slow as the afternoon heat built, and Matthew noticed Rebecca's oxen showing signs of strain. He dropped back to ride alongside her wagon, offering what advice he could about managing the team. Her quiet strength reminded him of his sister back in Virginia City, another war widow who'd refused to let grief define her future. Perhaps that's why he felt so driven to ensure these settlers reached their destination safely. As evening approached, Andrew called for them to make camp near a shallow creek. The cattle settled quickly, but Matthew's unease grew stronger as shadows lengthened across the prairie. He'd seen too many attacks begin at dusk to trust the peaceful scene. Michael disappeared into the gathering darkness to scout their perimeter, while Hannah organized the wagon train into a defensive circle. The night ahead would be long, and Matthew suspected it would be the first of many where sleep would prove elusive. The late summer sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Virginia City as Matthew Harris guided his horse past the livery stable, his Union cavalry saber still strapped faithfully to his saddle, despite the war being 3 years past. His hands trembled slightly as he caught sight of a Confederate battle flag hanging defiantly from the saloon's second story, a sight that sent unwelcome memories flooding back of screaming horses and cannon fire at Gettysburg. The town had changed since he'd last passed through, now clearly under the influence of unreconstructed Confederates who'd settled in the region. Leading a cattle drive through this territory would be dangerous enough without the added complication of running into former enemies. But the Lewis family had hired him to get their herd to Santa Fe, and Matthew had given his word. Rebecca Lewis met him outside her family's ranch house, her father David's absence notable. "Pa's been laid up with fever," she explained, pushing a strand of dark hair from her face. "The cattle need to reach market before winter, and you're the only drover willing to take on the job given the situation in town." Her words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. The situation became clearer as Matthew reviewed the proposed cattle trail with Rebecca. A group of ex-Confederate cavalry officers led by Colonel John King had essentially taken control of the region's ranching operations, demanding protection money and dictating which herds could pass through. Those who refused often found their cattle scattered or their drovers face down in creek beds. That evening in the Lewis family kitchen, David Lewis propped himself up in bed to explain further. "King and his men, they're trying to build their own little empire out here, acting like the war never ended. Been pressuring ranchers to sell out cheap, threatening those who won't comply. Even killed Andrew Wright last month when he tried standing up to them." The older man's voice was weak, but carried years of built-up anger. Matthew's nightmares returned that night as he slept in the Lewis's barn. Visions of cavalry charges and burning farmhouses mixing with more recent memories of King's men watching him from the saloon earlier that day. His hand instinctively reached for his revolver several times before dawn, each creak of the timber walls sending his heart racing. The cattle drive began 2 days later with a crew of just 4. Matthew, Rebecca, and 2 young cowhands named Michael Young and Grace Wright, Andrew's daughter. Grace's presence added personal stakes to their journey. Her quiet determination to see her father's killers brought to justice, evident in every stern glance toward town. They hadn't made it 5 miles before the first sign of trouble appeared. Victoria King, the colonel's wife, rode out to meet them with 2 armed riders. Her silk dress and parasol seemed out of place on the open range, but her words carried steel. "My husband sends his regrets that you've chosen such an unwise path. There's still time to reconsider his generous offer for the herd." Rebecca's response was ice cold. "Tell your husband that free Americans don't need his permission to drive their own cattle to market." Matthew admired her spine while silently calculating how quickly he could draw if Victoria's escorts reached for their guns. The war might be over on paper, but out here on the plains, old hatred still burned hot. The next 3 days brought constant harassment. Cattle scattered in the night, warning shots fired from distant ridges, waterholes found mysteriously fouled. Matthew's combat instincts stayed razor-sharp, but the constant tension wore at his nerves. Each unexpected sound brought back memories of Antietam, of comrades falling beside him, of horses screaming in artillery fire. Grace proved invaluable, her knowledge of local trails helping them avoid the worst of King's patrols. But she also saw how Matthew's hands shook when he thought no one was looking, how he sometimes stared vacantly into the distance like a man seeing ghosts. One evening she shared coffee with him on watch, speaking softly of her own losses, of the need to face down fear rather than let it rule you. A week into the drive, they encountered Hannah Wright, Grace's mother, at a remote line cabin. She brought news that King's men had burned 3 more independent ranches, driving the owners off their land. The colonel was consolidating his power, and their cattle drive had become a symbol of resistance that he couldn't allow to succeed. The next morning brought the first direct clash. Michael spotted riders approaching from the north, at least 8 men wearing Confederate gray cavalry jackets as if the war had never ended. Matthew felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the cold sweat on his palms, but Grace's words from the night before steadied him. Sometimes the only way past fear was through it. Their defensive position behind a low-rise gave them the advantage when King's men opened fire. Matthew's cavalry training took over, directing return fire to keep the attackers at bay, while Rebecca and Michael moved the herd toward deeper cover. Grace proved as good with a rifle as with a rope, her determined accuracy helping hold their position. The firefight lasted nearly an hour before King's men withdrew, leaving one of their own dead in the grass. Matthew recognized the fallen rider, a young soldier he'd seen in town named Abigail King's sweetheart. This would only make the colonel more determined to stop them, but turning back was no longer an option. They'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. As they made camp that night, Rebecca tended to Matthew's grazing wound while discussing their options. The direct route to Santa Fe was now likely blocked, but Grace knew of an alternate trail through rougher country. It would take longer and test both cattle and riders, but it offered their best chance of slipping past King's patrols. Matthew found himself studying Rebecca's face in the firelight, seeing strength there that reminded him of why he'd fought in the war, not for territory or politics, but for the right of good people to live free from tyranny. Perhaps helping her family's cattle drive was his way of continuing that fight, of finally finding purpose in peace as he'd once found it in war. The rough country proved more challenging than any of them had anticipated. Deep arroyos cut through the land like ancient wounds, forcing the cattle drive to wind carefully along narrow paths where a single spooked steer could trigger a deadly cascade. Matthew's cavalry experience helped him spot the safest routes, but each mile seemed to drag them further from civilization and deeper into a wild realm where Colonel King's influence might not reach, but other dangers lurked. Grace rode point, her knowledge of these lesser-known trails proving invaluable. She'd learned them from her father, she explained during an evening rest, back when he'd run supplies to isolated homesteads that didn't want attention from either side during the war. Matthew noticed how she avoided mentioning which side her family had favored, and he respected her discretion. The war's shadows were long enough without dragging them into the present. The cattle were holding up better than expected, though the lack of good grazing meant they'd lose weight before reaching Santa Fe. Rebecca worked tirelessly alongside her hired hands, showing a determination that impressed even the most hardened cowboys. At night, Matthew often found her studying her father's old maps by lamplight, searching for water sources they might have missed. One morning, they encountered a burnt-out homestead, its chimney standing like a lonely sentinel above blackened ruins. Matthew's hands trembled as he surveyed the destruction, memories of similar scenes from the war threatening to overwhelm him. But when Rebecca touched his arm, asking if he was all right, he forced the memories back. This damage was recent, perhaps a week old, and that meant whoever had done it might still be nearby. Signs of pursuit became more frequent as they pushed northward. Twice they spotted dust clouds on the horizon that could only be riders, though whether King's men or ordinary travelers, they couldn't be sure. Matthew set up night watches, teaching the others cavalry techniques for staying alert during the long, dark hours. He found himself growing closer to Rebecca during these quiet vigils, sharing stories of their lives before the war had changed everything. The turning point came at Dawn Creek, a normally peaceful water source that had sustained countless cattle drives. They arrived to find 2 wagons already there, settlers who'd fled from Virginia City after refusing to pay King's protection fees. Among them was Hannah, who'd once worked at the general store and knew Rebecca's family. Her husband had been beaten for speaking against the colonel's methods, and they'd left with little more than they could carry. Matthew felt the familiar tightness in his chest as Hannah described how King's men had changed from peacekeepers to oppressors, the same pattern he'd seen too many times during the war. Power corrupting those who'd once sworn to protect others. But this time, the anxiety that usually accompanied these memories was tempered by something stronger, a growing resolve to stop history from repeating itself. They shared their supplies with the settlers, and Rebecca insisted they join the drive to Santa Fe. It was dangerous adding civilians to their already vulnerable group, but leaving them behind would have been unthinkable. Matthew helped organize the wagons into the drive's formation, placing them where they'd be best protected if trouble came. Each night, he taught Hannah's teenage sons basic shooting skills, hoping they'd never need to use them. As they made camp near an old Spanish mission, Grace brought worrying news. She'd spotted signs of another group paralleling their course, staying just out of sight but definitely tracking them. The pattern was too deliberate for random travelers. These were experienced men who knew how to follow without being seen. Matthew recognized the tactics from his own military training. That night, Rebecca found Matthew standing watch, his eyes scanning the moonlit landscape. She didn't speak at first, just stood beside him in companionable silence. Finally, she said what they'd both been thinking. King's men weren't just following them anymore. They were hurting them. Each apparent escape route had subtly pushed them toward rougher territory, away from help or witnesses. The question was no longer if there would be a confrontation, but when and where their pursuers would choose to strike. The midday sun blazed mercilessly over the open plains surrounding Virginia City as Matthew Harris watched the Confederate riders approach his cattle herd through his brass spyglass. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the familiar surge of memories that threatened to overwhelm him whenever he saw gray uniforms. The 1,000 head of cattle he was driving north with John Wright's outfit had attracted unwanted attention. just as he'd warned they would. Behind him, the other drovers tensed, reading the change in their trail boss's demeanor. Rebecca Young rode up beside Matthew, her face etched with concern. She'd joined their drive 3 weeks ago, after her own small herd was absorbed into Wright's operation, and she'd quickly proven herself one of their most capable hands. More importantly, she seemed to understand the demons that haunted Matthew without him having to explain. "Those King boys again?" "Yeah," she asked quietly, referring to the former Confederate Colonel David King and his makeshift army that had been terrorizing the region. 8 riders, Matthew confirmed, collapsing the spyglass with a sharp snap. "Flying that damn stars and bars like the war never ended." His jaw clenched as he fought back the flood of memories, the thunder of cavalry charges, the screams of dying horses, the metallic taste of gunsmoke. He'd thought he'd left all that behind at Appomattox, but men like King seemed determined to keep the conflict alive out here on the frontier. The cattle they were driving represented the hopes of dozens of small ranchers who'd entrusted their stock to Wright's outfit, families who couldn't afford to lose their livelihood to King's band of unreconstructed rebels. John Wright rode up with Michael Lewis, his ramrod. The old rancher's weathered face was grim as he studied the approaching riders. "We've got 60 head of breeding stock in this drive that belonged to war widows back in Amarillo," he said. "I'll be damned if I'll let those gray-backed bastards take them." Matthew nodded, grateful that his employer understood what was at stake. It wasn't just about cattle anymore. It was about whether the war's end meant anything at all out here on the frontier. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder as King's men approached. Matthew recognized Andrew Harris among them. No relation, thank God, but a man he'd crossed paths with during the war. The sight of his former enemy wearing that uniform again made Matthew's chest tighten as the familiar panic tried to take hold. He forced it back, focusing on Rebecca's steady presence beside him and the weight of responsibility he carried for the families depending on this herd. "Colonel King sends his respects," Andrew called out, reining his horse to a halt a few yards away. "Says these cattle would serve a greater purpose supporting the true cause rather than feeding Yankees." His smirk made it clear he was enjoying Matthew's visible discomfort. Behind him, the other riders spread out in a practiced cavalry formation that Matthew knew all too well. They'd used similar tactics during the war to scatter enemy wagon trains. Grace Harris, the cook's wife who had insisted on joining her husband on the drive, emerged from the chuck wagon with her rifle already in hand. The sight of her quiet determination helped steady Matthew's nerves. She'd lost 2 brothers at Shiloh, but unlike King's men, she'd found a way to build a new life without being consumed by the past. Her example had helped Matthew more than she knew during the weeks of the drive. The confrontation that followed unfolded like a nightmare version of countless cavalry skirmishes. King's men tried to scatter the herd using the same tactics that had worked so well during the war, but Matthew had learned from those battles too. He'd positioned his drovers to counter the very maneuvers he'd once fought against, turning the rebels' own strategy against them. The cattle, already accustomed to their handlers, largely held together despite the chaos. Victoria Lewis, Michael's sister who served as their trail nurse, proved her worth when Andrew Harris took a bullet in the shoulder. Despite the fighting, she insisted on treating him, demonstrating the kind of compassion that Matthew struggled to find within himself. "The war's over," she told the wounded man as she worked. "Some of us are choosing to heal." Her words carried more weight than any bullet. The turning point came when Abigail King, the colonel's estranged daughter who had secretly been helping homesteaders resist her father's depredations, arrived with a marshal's posse from Santa Fe. The sight of federal badges finally convinced most of King's men to withdraw, though not before Andrew spat a final curse at Matthew. "This ain't over, Union." The cause ain't dead yet. But Matthew could see the uncertainty in his former enemy's eyes, the same weariness that he himself fought daily. As the dust settled, Rebecca helped Matthew collect himself after the familiar shake set in. She'd seen it before in other veterans, the way past battles could suddenly become present reality. "You faced them," she said simply. "Not just the men, but the memories too." Matthew nodded, watching as the herd settled back into its rhythm. Perhaps that was the real victory. Not defeating King's men, but proving that the past didn't have to dictate the future. The drive continued north, but something had changed. Matthew still carried his wartime wounds, both seen and unseen, but he'd proven to himself that they didn't have to control him. The cattle they were protecting represented more than just livestock. They were a testament to the possibility of building something new from the ashes of conflict. As the sun set over the plains, Matthew allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find that same kind of peace. The peaceful interlude following the skirmish proved short-lived. As Matthew and the others guided the herd toward Virginia City, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, both literal and figurative. Word reached them through a passing trader that King's men had assembled in force ahead, nearly 50 strong, determined to make their stand at Thunder Creek Crossing. The narrow passage through the bluffs would force the cattle drive into a natural bottleneck, exactly where the Confederate veterans wanted them. Rebecca noticed Matthew's hands tightening on his reins as they made camp that evening, his knuckles white with tension. The familiar tremors had returned, but there was something different in his eyes now, a steely resolve replacing the haunted look she'd grown accustomed to. Around the campfire, she watched him studying maps with David and Michael, his cavalry experience evident as he traced possible routes through the dangerous territory ahead. "We can't avoid the crossing," Matthew explained, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was proposing. "But we can use their expectations against them." The plan he outlined was bold, perhaps even reckless, but it carried the ring of hard-won battlefield wisdom. They would split the herd, using the smaller group as a diversion while the main body of cattle crossed at a treacherous but unguarded point upstream. Dawn brought a heavy mist rolling across the plains, obscuring the bluffs ahead in ghostly white. Matthew led the smaller contingent of riders and cattle toward the main crossing, every sense alert for the ambush he knew awaited them. The familiar smell of gun oil and leather brought back memories of other morning rides toward battle, but this time he forced himself to remain in the present, focused on the task at hand. The first shots rang out just as the sun broke through the mist. King's men had positioned themselves well, but Matthew had counted on their overconfidence. As bullets kicked up dust around them, he gave the signal. The small herd scattered in panic, creating the chaos he'd intended. Through the din, he heard the distant thunder of hundreds of hooves. The main herd was making its crossing upstream, just as planned. Rebecca and David led the larger group, pushing the cattle hard through the treacherous waters. The animals sensed the urgency, their instincts driving them forward despite the dangerous current. A few were lost to the rushing waters, but the majority made it across, scrambling up the far bank to safety. The sound of gunfire echoed from downstream, and Rebecca said a silent prayer for Matthew and the others, creating their desperate diversion. The fighting at the main crossing intensified. Matthew's small band put up enough resistance to maintain the illusion of a full defense, but carefully began their fighting retreat. King's men pressed forward, sensing victory, exactly as Matthew had hoped. The Confederate veterans were so focused on their presumed triumph that they failed to notice the dust cloud rising behind them, until it was too late. David and Michael led the charge, bringing the main herd back downstream at full gallop. The thundering mass of cattle caught King's men completely by surprise, trapped between the animals and the creek. Matthew watched as the Confederate veterans' carefully planned ambush dissolved into chaos, their horses panicking amid the surge of livestock. The tables had turned decisively. In the aftermath, they found King himself lying beneath his fallen horse, his leg crushed. The look he gave Matthew was one of bitter recognition, not just of defeat, but of a shared understanding. "The war really is over, isn't it?" King asked, his voice rough with pain and resignation. Matthew simply nodded, holstering his pistol. Some battles ended with bullets, but others needed to end with mercy. As they regrouped and tended to their wounded, Rebecca saw the change in Matthew more clearly than ever. The shadows still lurked behind his eyes, but they no longer seemed to control him. He had faced his demons in the heat of battle and emerged stronger, not by denying his past, but by choosing how to carry it forward. The cattle drive would continue north, but its significance had transformed. It was no longer just about moving livestock, but about finding a path toward healing. The sun was setting as they made camp that night. The herd safely gathered on the north side of Thunder Creek. Matthew sat apart from the others for a while, cleaning his rifle with practiced care. When Rebecca brought him a cup of coffee, she saw tears on his cheeks, not of sorrow or fear, but of release. Sometimes victory meant more than winning a fight. Sometimes it meant finding the strength to lay down old burdens and embrace the possibility of peace. Matthew Harris stood atop the hill overlooking the vast cattle herd, his weathered hands gripping the reins of his chestnut mare as the setting sun painted the plains in hues of amber and gold. The 1,000 head of cattle below represented more than just livestock. They were the future of Virginia City's settlers, and the last chance for many Confederate holdouts to finally lay down their weapons and embrace peace. His own demons from the war still haunted him, but this drive had become his path to redemption. The former Union cavalry captain watched as John Lewis, once a Confederate colonel, directed his men to encircle the massive herd. Though they claimed to be protecting the drive from Comanche raids, Matthew knew better. Lewis and his band of die-hard rebels had been systematically stealing cattle from Union-sympathizing ranchers, building their own empire in the territory. The peaceful facade of their operation barely concealed their true intentions. Rebecca Young rode up beside Matthew, her dark hair catching the last rays of sunlight. As the daughter of the region's largest Union-supporting rancher, she had more reason than most to fear Lewis's growing power. Yet she carried herself with quiet strength, refusing to be intimidated by the ex-Confederates who now controlled most of the supply routes between Virginia City and Santa Fe. Her presence steadied Matthew's nerves when the memories of Gettysburg threatened to overwhelm him. The nightmares had grown worse since agreeing to lead this drive. In his dreams, the bellowing of cattle transformed into the screams of dying men, and every flash of lightning became cannon fire. David Wright, Matthew's fellow Union veteran and closest friend on the drive, understood these moments. They had developed a system. When one man's demons surfaced, the other would take command, allowing time for the shadows of war to recede. Andrew King, the youngest of Lewis's lieutenants, approached their camp as dusk settled over the plains. His proposal seemed reasonable enough. Combine their herds for mutual protection through Comanche territory. But Matthew recognized the predatory gleam in the young Confederate's eyes. It was the same look he'd seen at Antietam, just before the ambush that had claimed half his squadron. Grace Harris, the camp's cook and unofficial healer, pulled Matthew aside after King's departure. Her gentle hands had stitched many of the drive's injuries, both physical and spiritual. "They're planning something," she whispered, describing the increased movement of armed riders along their flanks. Victoria Wright spotted supply wagons moving north from Amarillo, enough provisions for a long siege. The tension finally broke 3 days later when Michael Lewis, the colonel's brother, drove a stampeding herd into their night camp. In the chaos that followed, Matthew's war terrors threatened to paralyze him. But as Rebecca's scream cut through the darkness, something shifted in his mind. The past and present merged into crystal clarity, and for the first time since the war, his military training became a source of strength rather than trauma. Leading a countercharge through the stampede, Matthew and David organized the drovers into cavalry-style formations. Their disciplined response surprised the attacking Confederates, who had expected panic and disarray. Rebecca proved herself a skilled horsewoman, helping to turn the cattle while Grace coordinated the camp's defense with remarkable efficiency. The battle for the herd became a complex dance across the moonlit plains. John Lewis's men found themselves facing opponents who understood both cattle and combat, their tried-and-true tactics rendered ineffective by Matthew's strategic adaptations. When dawn broke, the attackers discovered they had been gradually pushed into a natural canyon, their retreat blocked by their own scattered herds. Hannah Wright, David's sister and the local telegraph operator, had managed to alert the territorial authorities before the attack. As morning light revealed the full scope of the confrontation, a combined force of Army cavalry and marshals appeared on the ridgeline. Lewis's kingdom, built on post-war resentment and stolen cattle, crumbled in the face of lawful authority. The aftermath brought unexpected healing. Many of Lewis's men, forced to finally confront the war's end, found purpose in legitimate ranching. Matthew's nightmares didn't vanish, but they lost their power to control him. Rebecca's quiet strength became his anchor, while Grace's wisdom helped many veterans, both Union and Confederate, find ways to live with their memories rather than be consumed by them. The cattle drive reached Virginia City intact, carrying with it the seeds of true reconciliation. Matthew and Rebecca married that autumn, their ranch becoming a symbol of how former enemies could build something new together. The war's shadows remained, but they no longer darkened the future. In time, even John Lewis came to understand that the greatest victory was not in prolonging the conflict, but in finding the courage to embrace peace. As years passed, the story of that cattle drive became legend in Virginia City. not for its violence but for how it helped heal the wounds of war. Matthew Harris never forgot the lessons learned on those plains, that sometimes the bravest act is facing one's own demons, and that redemption often comes not through victory over others, but through victory over oneself. The legacy of that fateful cattle drive rippled through the years, transforming Virginia City from a place divided by old hatreds into a testament to reconciliation. Matthew and Rebecca's ranch, nestled against the rolling plains where summer storms painted the grass in shifting shadows, became known as a sanctuary for those still wrestling with war's lingering ghosts. Former soldiers from both sides found work there, learning to see past the uniforms they once wore to the humanity they shared. Grace established a small clinic on the edge of town, where she treated physical and invisible wounds alike. Her gentle approach to helping veterans cope with their memories became renowned throughout the territory. She often collaborated with Matthew, using the peaceful rhythm of ranch work as therapy for troubled minds. The sight of former enemies working side by side in the corrals became a common one, each man finding his own path to healing. John Lewis's transformation proved the most profound. After years of bitter resistance, the death of his closest Confederate companion during a senseless dispute forced him to confront the futility of clinging to old grievances. He approached Matthew one winter morning, frost crackling under his boots, and offered his hand, not in surrender, but in recognition of a shared humanity that transcended their past divisions. The town itself evolved, shaking off its reputation as a stronghold of Confederate holdouts. New settlers arrived, drawn by stories of a place where the war's wounds were finally healing. Hannah's General Store became a gathering place where veterans shared coffee and conversation, their old rivalries dissolved in the steam rising from their cups. The counter, where guns had once been drawn, now hosted friendly games of cards and animated discussions about cattle prices. Rebecca's influence extended beyond the ranch, as she established a school that welcomed children from all backgrounds. The sons and daughters of Union and Confederate veterans sat side by side, learning a history that acknowledged both the war's complexity and the importance of moving forward. The school became a model for others throughout the territory, its success a testament to Rebecca's belief in education's power to bridge divides. Victoria, who had lost her husband at Gettysburg, found unexpected friendship with Abigail, whose brother fell at Antietam. Together, they started a quilting circle that grew into a support network for war widows. Their quilts, incorporating patches from both blue and gray uniforms, became powerful symbols of healing and unity. The women's strength in facing their shared grief helped others find their own path to acceptance. As the years turned, Matthew's nightmares gradually subsided, though they never completely vanished. He learned to see them not as weakness, but as reminders of the price of conflict and the value of peace. The ranch's success proved that prosperity could grow from cooperation rather than confrontation. Each spring roundup, with its mix of veteran cowboys working in harmony, reinforced this truth. The cattle trails that once brought tension now carried commerce and connection. Regular drives between Virginia City and markets in Amarillo became opportunities for former enemies to forge new bonds over shared challenges. The men who once fought each other now fought together against stampedes, rustlers, and the unpredictable moods of nature itself. David, a young ranch hand born after the war, grew up hearing the stories of how Virginia City changed. He witnessed the aging veterans gather at sunset, their conversations free of rancor as they shared memories of both triumph and loss. Through their example, a new generation learned that courage meant more than fighting. It meant having the strength to forgive and move forward. By the time Matthew and Rebecca's first grandchild arrived, Virginia City had become known not for its divided past, but for its united future. The ranch housed a new breed of cowboys who cared more about a man's character than his war record. The lessons learned during that long-ago cattle drive continued to bear fruit, proving that even the deepest wounds could heal when treated with understanding and time. In their twilight years, Matthew and Rebecca would often sit on their porch, watching the sun set over lands that had seen both battle and reconciliation. Their legacy lived on in the peaceful coexistence they helped forge, in the children who grew up knowing cooperation rather than conflict, and in the enduring truth that healing comes not from forgetting the past, but from learning to build a better future from its lessons.